That morning in the Appalachian foothills carried a softness so serene it made people forget the world could ever be cruel. A thin mist settled over the Tennessee hills, and the first rays of sunlight slipped through the trees, as if gently waking a small town still wrapped in quiet. Life here moved slow and kind. Neighbors still waved from their porches. Folks still believed that bad things happened only in places far away. Yet sometimes, the calmest mornings are the ones that quietly usher in tragedies. No, Blount County had always been a tightly knit community. People were used to seeing each other every day, used to the familiar hum of cars rolling down the old dirt road, used to the smiles of those they trusted would always return home at the end of a long day. That is why when someone disappears, the feeling goes beyond loss. It feels as if a piece of the town's own memory has been torn from its he. That day, no one realized that Diane Vasquez, the young locksmith so many adored, was stepping into the final morning of her life. There were no warning signs, no uneasy instinct, just an ordinary day of soft wind, falling leaves, and the misty roads Diane had walked since childhood. For years afterward, the people here would recall that morning with a tightness in their voices. They would say the sky was too clear, the air too gentle, and the mountains too silent, almost as if hinting that when tragedy arrives, it doesn't need noise. It can slip in quietly, unnoticed, and break apart everything a community once believed in. They didn't know that on that day, a single phone call would lead Diane to a place she would never return from. They didn't know her disappearance would become a wound, stretching across 2 decades. And they didn't know that the land that had always sheltered them, the red clay, the thick rolling hills, would be the very place that hid. This is not just the story of a crime. It is the story of a community living with heartbreak, a family waiting until hope faded, and a kind young woman whose future was stolen on an afternoon that seemed harmless. And it all began in that quiet moment, a moment no one realized was opening the darkest chapter in the hist. Before Diane's name became a headline in a case that would stretch nearly 2 decades, she was simply a young woman trying to build her life in the gentle hills of Tennessee. Born and raised in Blount County, she knew every curve of the dirt roads, every whisper of wind through the pines, every golden afternoon where neighbors sat on their porches and watched the sun slide behind the ridges. She belonged to this place in the most natural way, not because she had no other choices, but because her heart chose to stay. Her father used to say that, in small towns, kindness is the most valuable currency. Diane inherited that from him. When he passed away, she didn't pack up and leave for Knoxville or Nashville like so many others her age. She stayed and took over the family's old locksmith shop. To most people, it was just a small storefront off Main Street. But to Diane, it was a promise to her father and a responsibility to those who had trusted him for so many years. Anyone who walked into the shop remembered how warm it felt. Hundreds of keys of all sizes hung on the walls, glimmering under soft yellow light. On the counter were 2 dented brass cups her father used back when keys were still shaped by hand. The smell of metal and oil lingered in the air, a scent that should have felt harsh, but somehow felt comforting. This was where Diane didn't just work. She listened to the elderly tell stories of old winters. She helped young mothers with jammed door locks. She laughed with kids who brought in wobbly bike keys. That little shop didn't open its door with a key. It opened with Diane's kindness. People described her smile as soft, gentle, but strong in a way that wasn't about muscle or toughness. It was the strength of conviction. She would drive miles through the mountains in the middle of the night just to help a stranger with a frozen lock. She never charged extra to those who were struggling. In a place where people lived slowly and held on to each other, Diane was part of that bond. She embodied the quiet beauty of southern towns where everyone knows your name, and where one small act of generosity can be remembered for years. Her friends said Diane lived a simple life, but one full of hope. She was saving money to fix up her mother's house. She loved sitting on the porch on weekend evenings, watching fireflies flicker above the tall grass and listening to Dry Creek stream far in the distance. She didn't crave attention. She didn't dream of crowded cities. All she wanted was to work hard, care for her mother, and preserve the locksmith shop her father had built. But what people remembered most about Diane wasn't her work ethic or her kindness. It was her belief in the good within people. The way she treated everyone as if they deserved a chance. And perhaps that's why, when that final phone call came a stranger, asking for help with a stuck lock, she didn't question it. She didn't hesitate. Diane's instinct wasn't fear. It was helping. After she disappeared, the town looked back on everything they knew about her and realized her loss wasn't just another case. It was the theft of something pure. The absence of a soul who never harmed anyone. That is why her name never faded with time. It lived on in conversations shared over fences after work, in morning coffee at the diner on Main Street, in the eyes of those she once helped. For Diane's mother, the pain had no shape. It didn't explode into sobs. It lingered in silence in the nights she sat on the porch with the lights still on, waiting to hear her daughter's car turn into the driveway. She kept Diane's room exactly the same, kept her old tools, kept the habit of setting an extra cup of tea on the kitchen table at the hour Diane usually returned from work. For her, hope didn't die. It simply changed form, becoming a quiet prayer repeated night after night. Diane's story cannot be told coldly. It must be told through the heart of a community that still remembers her. Because Diane was not just the victim of a crime, she was a reminder that even the kindest people can be pulled into a darkness they never created. And it is precisely her kindness, the way she lived before she vanished, that made the entire town determined never to let her name fade into silence. That afternoon was strangely quiet. The last light of day spilled across the old signs on Main Street, reflecting softly on the glass window of Diane's locksmith shop. The faint smell of machine oil lingered in the room, giving the place a sense of constant activity, even on the slower days when she stood alone in the gentle silence. And it was in that silence that the phone on the counter suddenly rang, a simple sound that would later become unforgettable to so many in town. Diane picked up with her usual gentle voice, without a hint of caution. The man on the other end introduced himself as Warren. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice mountain folk often have, people who grew up repairing everything themselves unless they truly needed help. He said the lock on his cabin door was jammed, said the front door wouldn't close, and he couldn't leave it open overnight. A simple reason, a request that sounded completely normal for Diane's line of work. But the unsettling part wasn't the request, it was the way he spoke. He told his story with just the right amount of sincerity. A little concern, a little confusion, but nothing excessive. No pressure, no urgency. His tone was controlled, almost practiced. Psychologists later said it was this exact calmness that prevented Diane from sensing danger. The most effective manipulators never rush. They know urgency triggers suspicion. What they aim for is naturalness. The more natural they sound, the easier the trust comes. On the recording, his voice carried what Southerners often call polite calmness, a soft-spoken politeness that makes a person believe they're helping someone decent, not someone plotting each step to lure them into darkness. Eddie, the coworker working in the back, overheard half the call. He stepped out and watched as Diane wrote down the address. He knew Dry Creek, the thick woods, the isolation, the way the road seemed to disappear into the forest once the sun dipped. When he suggested she wait until morning, Diane only gave him a small smile. A smile that now haunts him. It was so gentle that no one could imagine it would be the last one he ever saw. What makes this story so haunting is how perfectly the killer targeted Diane's nature. He knew she was kind, knew she finished every job she accepted, knew she felt responsible for anyone who needed help. And he used that very goodness to pull her into his trap. He didn't need threats, didn't need to sound intimidating. He only needed to present himself as someone in trouble, and Diane would naturally fill that need. Men like Warren understand that kindness becomes a weakness when placed in the wrong hands. He exploited it with cold patience. He revealed nothing alarming, nothing that might push Diane to hesitate. Just a simple, harmless request well within her abilities and perfectly tailored to her instincts. When investigators later analyzed the call, one detail chilled them. Warren never asked if Diane could come. He spoke as if her coming was already a given, as if he had known her for years, as if he had watched her, understood her, knew she would never leave someone stranded. His tone carried a certainty that made experts admit he did not choose her randomly. He chose her because he knew she would go. The psychological profile of the killer described Warren as someone highly skilled at reading emotions. He wasn't impulsive. He was calculated. He chose the timing right before dark, chose a location with weak phone reception, chose a story familiar enough to avoid suspicion. Beneath the calm of his voice was a thoroughly crafted plan. There is a detail that still breaks people's hearts. Diane had told her mother she'd be home before dinner. A simple phrase used daily in Southern families. A small promise wrapped in warmth. Diane believed it. She fully expected to return. But the man on the phone had never intended for that to happen. When she hung up, the phone went silent again, as if it had never carried a call that would divide her life in two. Before the call, and after the call, a moment that, if rewound in slow motion, might reveal a tiny flicker of warning, but real life doesn't offer clear signs the way movies do. Sometimes the cruelest thing is the absence of any sign at all. Diane gathered her tools, locked the shop, and left for what she believed would be a quick, one-hour job. But as her tires rolled onto the road leading to Dry Creek, everything she trusted about people was being used by one man and only one for his own darkness. And that call, simple and ordinary on the surface, yet filled with the careful calculation of a predator, became the first step in leading Diane into the shadow that would stretch nearly 20 years over the investigation. Tennessee has always been cherished for its wild beauty. The Appalachian Mountains stretch across the horizon like the spine of an ancient world, covered in oak, pine, and the small creeks that weave through polished stones. But beneath that beauty lies a harshness only longtime locals truly understand. It's a place where nature can erase evidence far faster than any human hand. And in Diane's disappearance, the land she grew up loving became the cruelest keeper of secrets. Dry Creek is notoriously difficult to search. The narrow dirt road winding through dense trees lets sunlight slip through only in thin, uneven patches. In the fall, leaves drop like rain, covering the ground so quickly that footprints vanish within hours. Darkness settles fast, and one wrong step can make a person feel swallowed by the forest. To outsiders, it may look poetic. To search teams, it was a weeks-long nightmare. Seasoned hunters in the area often said the Dry Creek woods have their own way of holding on to anything that enters them. Rainwater flows down tree roots and turns soil into soft channels that erase tire tracks. Strong winds sweep layers of dry leaves over the forest floor, hiding whatever lay beneath by afternoon. And Tennessee's clay, especially the reddish kind near the hills, is one of the most challenging materials for any search effort. It's thick, heavy, and after just a bit of rain, it hardens like natural cement. When forensic teams described the terrain where Diane vanished, they said that in Tennessee, time isn't the greatest eraser of evidence the earth is. The clay here preserves what's buried deep inside it, but wipes away anything on the surface. A footprint survives only a few hours before disappearing beneath damp leaves. A disturbed patch of dirt can look perfectly untouched after a couple of light rains. Creeks that dry out in summer can flood without warning in autumn, washing away whatever sits along their banks. For investigators, this meant they weren't just fighting a perpetrator. They were fighting nature itself. And in these mountains, nature does not take sides. During the first days of searching, deputies and volunteers entered the woods in groups. They pushed through thickets, shined their lights down rocky ravines, and looked for anything that might lead to Diane. But every morning they returned, the landscape had shifted again. Fallen leaves covered old trails. Overnight rain erased what they thought were clues. The sloping hills looked so identical that newcomers could get lost within minutes. One officer said, "The Tennessee forest isn't just vast, it's alive." And, as the case dragged on, Many began to sense that the woods were hiding something they desperately needed to find. To understand the difficulty fully, you have to understand the clay itself. The red clay of the Smokies compresses incredibly fast. If something is buried in it, just a few months can harden it into a solid mass. The remarkable part is how undisturbed it appears without heavy tools. To the naked eye, anything beneath it is almost impossible to detect. This explains why, in 1998, even though search teams walked directly over the area where the truth was buried, they saw nothing unusual. The terrain also creates sounds that mislead search teams. Wind sweeping across the ridges can sound like someone calling Diane's name. Dripping water from a crevice can mimic something falling nearby. These sounds sparked moments of false hope, only for searchers to return to the trail in heavy silence. But the deepest pain didn't come from the search failures. It came from the faces of Diane's loved ones as they looked at the land where she disappeared. They stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the dark spaces between the trees, wondering if she was somewhere just a few steps away. They feared she had suffered, feared she had been left alone in this cold, unforgiving place. But their worst fear was the unseen. Because in Tennessee, the absence of evidence does not mean the absence of truth. This terrain didn't just hide Diane's body. It hid justice. It hid the answers her mother prayed for every night. It hid the piece of truth the community needed to live without guilt. Tennessee may look gentle in daylight, but when it comes to the secrets buried in its clay, it is silent, like a watchman unwilling to reveal anything. For years, investigators returned to Dry Creek over and over, each time with new hope. Each time leaving disappointed. Not because they lacked skill, but because this land is shaped in a way that makes searching for a missing person nearly impossible. And it is bitter to think that Diane, a woman who spent her life helping others, was hidden for nearly 2 decades by the very earth she loved. Not because the land chose to, but because this is its nature. Vast, beautiful, indifferent, a place that can offer the most breathtaking sunsets and conceal the deepest sorrows of a small community. Only when excavators pierced that seemingly ordinary soil years later did Tennessee finally loosen its grip. But at the time Diane vanished, the mountains and the red clay played their role. They kept the truth and left people clinging to fragile hope in the darkness of the woods. By the time the sun slipped behind the hills of Blount County, Diane still hadn't come home like she had promised her mother. At first, the delay didn't cause much alarm. Folks around here were used to long drives out to remote cabins, and sometimes a job took longer than expected. But when the clock passed 7:30 and darkness swallowed the town, Diane's mother began stepping onto the porch more often. She stared down the gravel road leading to the house as if, by looking long enough, her daughter's pickup truck might appear out of the night. But the road stayed empty. No headlights cutting through the mountain darkness. The silence grew long enough to be frightening, and when 9 o'clock came and went, the fear her mother had been holding back finally settled in her chest. Diane never came home late without calling. The next morning, when Eddie drove past the locksmith shop, he saw the lights still off. The spare key sat exactly where Diane always left it. There was no sign she had returned after leaving the day before. A wave of unease hit him immediately. He called Diane's mother. Then both called the sheriff's office. Within an hour, deputies were driving along Dry Creek Road, a narrow path winding between thick pines and low fog-covered fields. It was the place mentioned in the last call. A road no one liked taking after dark, but that morning, it was the only thread leading toward answers. Not long after, they found Diane's truck. Her blue Chevy sat tilted on the right side of the dirt road, as if someone had pulled over in a hurry. The doors were locked, but the key was still in the ignition. Her wallet lay untouched inside the cabin. No signs of theft, no signs of struggle. Her toolbox was missing, but everything else was undisturbed. It made the scene feel strange. If this had been a roadside assault, it didn't resemble any the deputies had encountered before. The driver's seat had been pushed slightly forward, as if Diane had leaned down to reach for something on the floor before stepping out. Dust on the floor mat showed someone had been in and out, but there were no drag marks, no clear footprints. And what chilled officers most was the silence of that place. Only morning fog drifting across the road like it was guarding a secret the mountains refused to reveal. From the truck, faint tire impressions led deeper into the woods toward a rusted metal gate, the kind used to block access to hunting land. Beyond it lay a narrow trail leading toward an old cabin. When deputies pushed the gate open, the ground beneath was still soft, like a vehicle had passed not long before. But the tracks ended abruptly, just a few hundred yards in. Search dogs were brought in. They picked up Diane's scent for a short distance from the truck, and then it vanished. Not faded, not diverted, just gone, as if someone had lifted her off the ground. For those in search and rescue, this is always one of the worst signs. At the nearby cabin, the door was shut tight. No break-ins, no signs of a struggle. The yard behind was empty except for a strange patch of flattened earth, as if something heavy had been dragged across it. A small, dark stain, mixed with sawdust, was collected for testing. But in 1998, forensic labs in small counties couldn't analyze evidence the way they can today. All investigators could do was document, send the samples off, and wait week after week for results. Meanwhile, the news of Diane's disappearance spread through town. Neighbors, people who had known her all her life, volunteered to join the search. They walked the hills, shined flashlights down ravines, called her name into the cold wind. They posted her picture at gas stations, grocery stores, and churches. No one wanted to believe she was in danger, but the silence of the forest began to scare them. The first days are always the most critical in any missing person case. In the first 36 hours, hope burns bright. But as time stretches on, it dims. And when 3 full days passed without a single new lead, people quietly began to fear what they hadn't said out loud. Investigators knew one unsettling truth. People who go missing in the mountains usually leave something behind. A torn piece of fabric, a footprint, a dropped item. The scene was too clean, too quiet, too orderly. It pointed investigators toward a chilling possibility: she hadn't wandered off. She hadn't had an accident. She had been taken. Forensics had little to offer. No foreign fingerprints in the truck. No blood. No drag marks. And the most confusing detail of all, Diane's wallet was untouched. If this had been a violent attack, most offenders would have stolen something. But this one hadn't. That meant the motive wasn't theft. It was something else. Something far darker. By the 5th night, the sheriff stood before the press and admitted they had no answers. Diane's case file thickened with scattered notes, conflicting witness statements, leads that went nowhere, and the vast Tennessee wilderness, full of secrets, seemed determined to swallow every trace investigators tried to find. But the most haunting silence wasn't at the scene. It was inside the small house where Diane's mother waited. Each night she kept the porch light on, set out a cup of tea at the hour Diane usually came home. Her hope didn't die. It only trembled like a candle waiting for someone to blow it out. Time kept moving, hour by hour, day by day, week by week. But what no one knew then was that the truth lay right beneath the soil they had been walking over. The case stalled, and all they were left with was a truck sitting alone on a dirt road and a question that hung in the air for years. Where did she go after she stepped out of that truck? For years, the name Warren Hask existed only as a faint line in the faded case files of Blount County. A name so ordinary, no one paid attention. A quiet man living at the edge of town, where the dirt road into the woods served as a wall between the life of the community and the life he kept to himself. But when the truth surfaced, nearly 2 decades later, the town realized that his plainness had been the perfect disguise. It hid a mind that was twisted, isolated, and far more dangerous than anyone ever imagined. Warren grew up in circumstances no child should endure: an alcoholic father, a mother who left when he was 6. Neighbors recalled the shouting that echoed from the old wooden house whenever his father drank too much. In small Tennessee towns, people try to help one another. But some doors remain closed, no matter how hard others try to open them. The door to Warren's home was one of those. Even as a child, he displayed a kind of presence that unsettled people without them knowing why. Quiet, detached, unconnected, not troublesome, but not safe either. Other children avoided walking the same path as him. Adults described him as someone whose eyes never reflected what he felt. A strange emptiness, a silence no one could read. As he grew older, Warren withdrew further. He took odd jobs, mostly at farms or small lumber sheds. No one knew if he had friends. No one ever saw him with anyone. His home sat deep in the woods, hidden beneath tall pines. To most, it seemed like the house of a man who preferred solitude. But to those who had encountered him, the unease lingered long after the interaction ended. Psychologists who later examined Warren's profile made a striking observation. Warren wasn't an impulsive offender. He belonged to the type who stored rage and loneliness the way others store memories. Years of childhood abuse, combined with a lifetime of isolation, created a distorted worldview. He learned to live in silence, to watch, to hide emotions most people display naturally. But the most frightening part wasn't his past. It was how he used it to shape a method of predatory behavior that was quiet, patient, and deliberate. Warren didn't choose victims at random. He chose those he believed would trust him, kind women, responsible women, women like Diane. Police records showed that Warren had been linked to several strange incidents, though none with enough evidence to charge him. A woman reported that he had followed her from the grocery store to her home, but she never felt confident enough to confront police. A family said he often stood at the tree line near their backyard, watching in silence, disappearing whenever they approached. These events were noted briefly, then forgotten. No witnesses, no evidence, and a small town reluctant to accuse someone based on intuition alone. What shook investigators when Diane's case was reopened was the psychological assessment showing Warren's preference for victims who were independent yet deeply compassionate. Women easily swayed by a gentle voice and a harmless story. He didn't seek out the weak. He sought the strong because overpowering strength gave him a sense of control he had never experienced as a child. For Warren, taking a strong woman captive was his way of rewriting a life in which he had always been powerless. His motive wasn't money. It wasn't personal hatred. It was absolute control, a form of dominance he had been denied his entire youth. In his twisted mind, that power could only be achieved by stripping someone else of their freedom. When experts analyzed the fateful phone call, they noticed how calculated Warren's phrasing was. He didn't beg. He didn't sound overtly worried. He spoke as if he already knew Diane would come. This suggested he had studied her, perhaps watched her at the locksmith shop, understood her routine, recognized her kindness. A hallmark of a patient predator. What troubled investigators most was the possibility that Warren had tried this before. Maybe with someone else. Maybe successfully, without anyone ever knowing. Several disappearances in neighboring counties from the late 1990s were reviewed, but none contained enough evidence to prosecute him. Still, they all shared the same pattern. Remote woods, isolated land, victims who vanished without trace. Criminal psychology indicated Warren lived in two worlds. Outwardly, he appeared calm and polite enough to avoid suspicion, but internally, he carried years of unresolved anger and crushing loneliness. When these forces coexist long enough, a person can stop seeing victims as human beings. They become opportunities, a way to feel powerful, a cruel response to a childhood where power was never his. The saddest part is that Warren wasn't a stranger to the town. People had seen him at the grocery store, had exchanged casual greetings, had assumed he was nothing more than a lonely man living in the woods. No one imagined the person behind that quiet exterior was capable of calling Diane on a peaceful afternoon and luring her into something he had planned long before. As the case came together years later, and the pieces finally fit like the last fragments of a puzzle, the town realized they weren't just looking at a criminal. They were looking at the result of years of overlooked warning signs. They learned that sometimes the quietest person can be the most dangerous. Warren Hask didn't just take Diane's life. He took the trust that had always been the heart of southern small towns. And the most painful truth is that he did it with such calmness that even years later, people still question whether they ever saw anything unusual in him at all. His normalcy was his disguise and the most terrifying part of who he was. In the first days after Diane disappeared, the community still held on to hope. They believed she was simply trapped somewhere, or perhaps injured, and waiting for someone to find her. But as weeks passed, then months, hope slowly became a luxury people wanted to cling to, but no longer had the courage to mention aloud. And year after year, the silence surrounding the case spread over the town like a veil, a coldness felt even in the hottest Tennessee summers. For Diane's mother, each passing year was another cut. She kept her daughter's room exactly as it was, the scarf draped over the chair. The calendar still open to the month Diane vanished. Every evening she turned on the porch light as if performing an invisible ritual. A small glow in the Tennessee darkness, a beacon, she prayed. Diane might somehow see and follow home. But as the years rolled on, that light became the symbol of a grief no words could capture. Holidays were the hardest. The empty chair at the dinner table made the room feel bigger than it should. She still cooked Diane's favorite dishes, even though no one would sit in her place. Deep down, she knew she had to keep living. Yet some days, she simply sat by the window, looking down the dirt road leading to the house, wondering if Diane could still hear her calling her name. For Eddie, Diane's co-worker, the anguish came in another form. He had been the last person to see her. He had been the one who warned her not to go to Dry Creek at dusk. And for years, he asked himself whether a different sentence, a firmer tone, might have changed the ending. He carried that question like a shadow time refused to erase. Whenever the shop bell rang, he looked toward the door with an unreasonable hope that Diane might walk in, smiling, saying she had only been gone a while. It never happened. But the hope never fully died either. Law enforcement wasn't spared from regret. Deputies who searched the woods in 1998 remembered every hill, every trail they walked. They remembered returning at dusk with boots heavy with clay, remembered the nights spent staring at maps, wondering what they had missed. They wanted to find Diane not just out of duty, but because they knew her family. Knew this was not a case they could simply archive and forget, but as leads dried up, so did the momentum. The case files slowly moved from their desks to the county's storage room, not because they didn't care, but because there was nothing left to follow. A stalled investigation is something no one wants to admit. But it was the truth. There was hardly any evidence, no witnesses, no trail. Diane's case was like a door slammed shut in front of investigators, and every attempt to reopen it was met with the deep, echoing silence of the Tennessee woods. And the community, they never forgot her. Every person in town remembered Diane as part of their story. But over time, the collective pain fractured into smaller pieces. Each person carried one. A piece of guilt. A piece of fear. A piece of sorrow. They held vigils, lit candles on every anniversary of her disappearance. But even candlelight couldn't illuminate a truth buried for 19 years. Children growing up in the town heard Diane's story as a warning. No one walked alone after dark anymore. Young women kept their eyes on every unfamiliar vehicle. Dry Creek, once a weekend picnic spot, became a place people avoided. Not because the forest had changed, but because the town's memory had. The woods were the same, but the feeling of them wasn't. During those 19 years, Warren lived in silence. No one knew what secrets he carried. People saw him at grocery stores, on trails, always with the same unreadable expression. No one accused him. No one watched him. They didn't know what he had taken from Diane or from her family. All they saw was an aging man fading quietly into the background. The unfairness of that left many too angry to speak. As for Diane's mother, she never left Tennessee. People advised her to move, to find a place where the memories wouldn't hurt so much. But she said leaving would be like giving up hope. So she stayed. She waited, even if hope had thinned to a fragile thread, She held on to it with everything she had. Throughout those 19 years, the most painful part wasn't the silence of the case, it was the silence of time itself. Time teaches people to live without answers, to accept loss, but for Diane's family, time didn't heal. It deepened the wound. Each year, a reminder that justice had not come. Older folks in town would whisper that sometimes Tennessee's land holds on to things that don't belong to it, that the woods stay quiet, the mountains stay still, and the red clay keeps its secrets through storms and seasons. But no one imagined that nearly 2 decades later, that very land would reveal its truth in a way no one expected. And through all those 19 sorrow-filled years, one promise kept them standing. When the truth finally surfaced, they would stand beside Diane's family. They would not let her be forgotten, and they would not let silence be the end of her story. Many years after Diane's name had faded into dust-covered folders, it was the very ground that once swallowed her secrets that became the witness. On a gray morning in 2017, as the rumble of construction equipment echoed along Dry Creek Road, no one realized that the cold steel bucket of an excavator was about to strike the truth a community had waited nearly 2 decades to find. The machine operator later said he felt a strange jolt in the controls, not the vibration of rocks or tree roots, but something softer, denser, shaped by time rather than nature. When he climbed down to inspect it, he saw something even a man familiar with Tennessee's red clay could never prepare for. A darkened scrap of fabric, rotted but still carrying the weave of cloth once touched by human hands. And beside it, embedded in the clay, a pale fragment of bone, brittle, fragile, unmistakable. He stepped back, as if the earth itself had exhaled the breath of the dead. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. They had found Diane. Within minutes, the area was sealed off. Deputies, forensic units, and seasoned specialists from Knoxville converged on what had once been an overlooked patch of woods. They knelt and worked slowly, carefully, with respect for the victim and patience for the truth. The soil was cleared layer by hand, because everyone there understood. After 19 years of darkness, the ground was finally giving something back. The shallow grave was about 4 feet deep, just enough to hide a body, just enough for time to erase the surface. But Tennessee does not forget. Its soil is heavy, its clay dense and adhesive, capable of preserving what lies beneath. The forensic anthropologists recognized immediately that although this terrain had hindered the search for years, it had become a gift for science. It preserved bones, personal items, and even traces the killer never imagined would survive. When enough of the skeleton had been uncovered for a preliminary assessment, a forensic specialist noticed the wrists and ankles first. The joints were misaligned, showing signs of cutting and unnatural compression. This indicated the victim had been bound with something rigid, not rope. When corroded electrical wiring was discovered nearby, all doubts aligned into a single conclusion: this had never been a disappearance. It was deliberate homicide. But what silenced the entire team was the smallest object: a brass keychain clasp, found beneath the ribcage, preserved where time could not steal it. The letters DV etched faintly but unmistakably. Diane had engraved her own initials on the first keychains she ever made after opening her shop. Only 5 existed. One was found in her wallet the night she vanished. One was still in the shop. And the third now lay in the earth beside her bones. Those present said the woods fell completely silent. That was the moment the truth became real. It wasn't rumor. It wasn't myth. It had a shape, a name, a story. As soil, cloth, tools, and bone were taken to the lab, forensic scientists launched the largest analysis the case had ever seen. Under the microscope, Diane's skull revealed a crescent-shaped indentation along the temple. They recognized it instantly, the mark of a claw hammer, the kind commonly found in a contractor's toolkit. The fracture patterns told them everything. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. A decisive blow meant to kill. And the soil told its own truth. Particles of fine concrete dust and engine oil were found embedded in the fabric of Diane's clothing. These materials are typical of garages or contractor workshops. When compared to samples from Warren Hask's old workshed, the match was so precise the experts didn't need further persuasion. But the evidence that shattered Warren's years of denial came from something nearly invisible. A small fragment of deteriorated latex glove found just beneath the bone. Most of it had decayed, but the inner surface retained faint ridge patterns, the ghost of a fingerprint. When the lab ran the impression, the result appeared with near absolute certainty. Warren Hask. Not transferred, not circumstantial. A direct print from the burial site. Then came the DNA. 3 male DNA samples were extracted from surviving fibers. 2 had degraded beyond use, but the third remained intact. A match to Warren's DNA from a 1996 domestic dispute report. The silence of nearly 20 years began to crack. Investigators who had carried this case in their hearts said that seeing the match felt like release, not because they had finally cornered the killer, but because they could finally give something back to the family, the truth. In Tennessee, people often say the red clay has a long memory. It can hide a secret, but it will not keep it forever. And when the earth finally opened, it returned more than a body. It returned a voice. The voice of a young woman stolen from her life. A voice that forensic science translated into fractures, fibers, particles, and prints, all of it telling the same story. A story the killer once boasted no one would ever uncover. But Tennessee did not forget, and science did not forget. In early 2018, when Warren Hask was led into the Blount County courtroom, few recognized the man who had silently haunted the community for nearly 2 decades. He walked slowly, shoulders heavy, hair graying, eyes empty. But exhaustion did not make him innocent. It only proved he had been running long enough, and time had finally caught him. The courtroom was so crowded there wasn't a single empty seat. Elderly residents who had once searched the woods with flashlights in 1998 sat quietly in the back row. Younger deputies, who grew up with Diane's disappearance as a shadow over their childhoods, stood silently along the wall. Diane's family sat in the front, her mother clutching the photo she had carried for almost 20 years. The room felt thick, as if everyone was waiting for something, waiting for the truth to finally rise. The prosecution began not with evidence, but with Diane. They spoke of the gentle young woman from Main Street's locksmith shop, of how she worked late to help strangers. They spoke of the soft smile everyone remembered, and of the simple, tragic promise she made to her mother before leaving home that day. "I'll be back before dinner." The courtroom fell silent. Stories like that remind people that victims are not case numbers. They are human beings, woven into the life of a community, into the memories of people who once waved at them on the street. Then came the truth, layer by layer. Each piece of evidence piercing through 19 years of fog. They showed photos of the excavation site. They presented tool marks on the skull, proof of a claw hammer strike. They introduced soil samples matching the dirt from Hask's workshop, and then they opened the DNA slide. A wave of whispers moved across the courtroom when the prosecutor said the words the town had waited nearly 20 years to hear. DNA found on Diane's clothing matched Warren Hask. Not contamination, not transfer, direct physical contact at the time of attack. Then came what they called the legal kill shot, the decayed latex glove fragment with a faint fingerprint, still clear enough for the forensic lab to identify. The match was undeniable. Warren Hask had worn that glove while burying Diane in the Tennessee soil. Each time the prosecution read a new piece of evidence, Hask's expression shifted, at first blank, then twitching, then hollow, as if every detail peeled away a layer of the mask he had worn for 2 decades. But the most devastating blow didn't come from science. It came from a person. When the prosecutor called the next witness, the entire courtroom turned. A woman stepped up to the stand, small frame, trembling voice. It was Warren Hask's ex-girlfriend, the one who had once lived with him, trusted him, heard things he tried to drown in alcohol. She gripped the microphone, eyes moving across the courtroom before settling on Diane's family. Then she spoke. She told them about one drunken night, about one sentence she had spent years trying to forget. He said, "They'll never find her, because she never left my house." The courtroom froze. Diane's mother lifted her hand to her mouth, fighting back a cry. Old sheriff's deputies bowed their heads, and those who had dug through Dry Creek's clay in 1998 felt their hearts sink like stones. The testimony wasn't the only evidence, but it was the key that unlocked the psychology of the crime. It proved Hask didn't just kill. He believed he was smarter than everyone else. He believed he could hide his sins forever. He believed Tennessee's silence was on his side. The defense tried to fight back. They said memories fade. They said forensic errors happen. They said DNA transfer was possible. But the prosecution responded with one sentence that broke the defense clean in half. Cross-contamination does not explain the defendant's glove being found in the victim's grave. Every door slammed shut for Hask in that moment. When the verdict was read, time seemed to hold its breath. The jury didn't need a day. They needed 4 hours. Guilty. On every count, without hesitation. Witnesses said Hask didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't react. He just stared at the polished wood floor, as if he finally understood that the silence of the earth was never his to claim. It belonged to Diane, to the truth, and the truth had won. During the victim impact statement, Diane's mother approached the stand. She didn't yell, she didn't curse him. Her voice was soft, almost like a prayer. You took my daughter, but you didn't take her memory, and you didn't take justice. The courtroom rose to its feet, not for the verdict, but for the woman who had carried a flame through 20 years of darkness. As Hask was taken away, some said he didn't look back, but maybe he didn't have to, because his downfall echoed through that room like a sentence without words. And just like that, Tennessee finally had its answer. When the casket of Diane Vasquez was brought back to the small town where she was born, where she grew up, and where she vanished, a strange feeling swept across the community. It wasn't joy, and it wasn't simple grief. It was the exhale of people who had carried a question in their hearts for nearly 20 years. The question every Tennessee resident silently asked whenever they drove past Dry Creek: where had the young woman gone? On a quiet morning, Diane's family held her final burial. No cameras, no noise, just a light breeze and the sound of leaves falling. Those who had searched for her in 1998 stood in a long, hushed line, as if time had turned back to the exact moment they walked into the woods with flashlights. Diane's mother placed her hand on the casket, no trembling, no desperation. She whispered something no one else could hear. Some said it was a goodbye. Others said it was gratitude. Perhaps it was simply a mother's warmth finally reaching her daughter again. Forensics could bring truth. The courtroom could bring justice. But only humanity could bring closure. The meaning of Diane's case extended far beyond a guilty verdict. It touched the Appalachian community, the officers who searched those woods, and every mother who once stood on her porch waiting for headlights to appear on the gravel road. People began to speak of Diane's case not as a tragedy alone, but as a reminder that time does not erase truth. It simply makes truth wait longer. Dry Creek, once a symbol of fear and darkness, became proof that science and persistence could break even the deepest silence. Today, a small sign stands along that road to honor Diane. Not flashy, not ornate. Just her name, a gentle reminder that a life never truly disappears as long as someone remembers it. Years later, forensic training programs across the state still teach her case. They call it a lesson in Tennessee clay, how it preserves what no one expects. A lesson in persistence, never closing a file because years have passed or clues are thin. But above all, they say it is a lesson in humanity, that every number in a case file was once a person, someone loved, someone who deserved to be found. And in Diane's story, the most haunting truth was not how she died, but how she was found. Not through confession, not through the killer's remorse, but through a slight, accidental jolt of a metal blade striking earth, a technical glitch, a moment that seemed meaningless. Yet, it opened the door Diane had been knocking on for 19 years. It taught people that justice does not always arrive in the bright lights of a courtroom. Sometimes, it lies underground, waiting for someone patient enough, respectful enough, to listen. The narrator's voice slows, as if inviting the audience to take the final message to heart. For Blount County, Diane's case wasn't just a story of crime. It was a story of endurance, of people who refused to give up, of a mother who lit a candle at 8 p.m. every night, holding on to a promise no one else could hear, and of a young woman who fought until the very last moment, leaving her mark on her own tools, as if to say she was still here and she would be found. For us, hearing this story years later, Diane's case teaches one thing above all: justice may come late, very late, but it does not lose its way. Narrator's closing words. When you drive through Tennessee's winding backroads, where mountains cast shadows over small streams and the wind carries the scent of southern pine, remember this: beneath that red clay lie stories not yet told, and sometimes all it takes is a single accidental moment for them to return to the light. Diane Vasquez finally came home, not in the way her family hoped, but in the way truth always chooses,